If your law firm is thinking about starting a podcast but you're not sure how to go about it, or even if you should, stay tuned. Hi, welcome to the BD Roundtable. We're here today with Sam Burrett to talk about the pros and cons of starting a podcast for a law firm. Now, Sam recently started his very own podcast called The Leading Lawyer Project, where he interviews top lawyers who are shaping the future of law. So we're going to get his thoughts about how the legal industry is adopting podcasting and what are some of the difficulties and technicalities that go on behind the scenes to produce episodes. So if you want to join future calls like this, head on over to bdroundtable.com to sign up to become a member for free. When you do, you'll be able to watch all the Q&A sessions, and you'll get access to a private Slack group community, which is full of legal marketers like yourself. Now, here's Sam. So I'm excited to have you on the call because I've been thinking, well, how can a law firm take advantage of this medium, right? We've seen lawyers host their own podcasts, or people like you talk about the profession. But really, do you think this is something that law firms could really take on and market their podcast?
I think it definitely can be. And maybe the evidence for that is that we've seen it work really well in other industries, right? So definitely if you are interested in sales or marketing, which I am in addition to the law, you will find lots of great digital media marketing agencies or sales training companies that have their own podcasts. And they use that as a medium to engage with their existing clients, with potential clients, and also to demonstrate expertise within the market. And I think the legal industry is full of relatively slow adopters. We tend to be more risk averse and conservative than other industries. And that could be part of the reason why we haven't seen podcasts become a really big part of law firm marketing just yet. But the opportunity is definitely there. We've seen it demonstrated in other industries. And I'm excited to see more law firms take advantage of that moving forward.
Right. I mean, as you see the industry becoming more client-centric, law firms are really starting to think about, okay, what value can I give away, right? So they're starting to do LinkedIn, they're starting to shift to video, which is great. But, I think getting a lawyer or a law firm or a group of lawyers to commit to something like this, because when you start a podcast, you got to stick with it for a bit, right? Or else you just have one or two or five episodes, and there they are. They just kind of sit on on the internet somewhere. So, how would you recommend a law firm approach starting a podcast?
Yeah, I guess speaking from my own personal experience, I had both a selfish personal motivation and then maybe a more broader motivation. And I think that's probably useful for law firms as well. The selfish motivation for me was to build a great network and meet some really forward-thinking lawyers. But from a law firm perspective, you might have a motivation to give your lawyers the opportunity to hone their knowledge and share that with more people, to give them a platform to connect with potential clients. You might have a selfish motivation to build your brand and attract better new clients. But I think there's also that other motivation which you've hinted at, which is as we move to a more client-centric world and a more client-centric legal industry, we want to be giving away as much information for free as possible. And that's difficult for lawyers to do because we tend to ascribe the amount of value that we have for clients or tie that to the amount of knowledge that we have, right? And we charge based on hourly rates, and we those hourly rates are tied to how much knowledge we're giving away to clients. But I think what lawyers will find is as they enter the realm of podcasting and as blogging has shown, the more information you give away for free to clients, the more interesting work you actually end up doing for clients in the long run. You give away the information that they immediately need to help them solve problems, and then they come back to you with even bigger problems that require even more work. And then as a lawyer, you're not answering the questions that you actually don't want to answer for clients. You're actually doing more interesting work.
Yeah. So when we're giving away this information, there's also more of the pro bono aspect of it, right? Because you're providing access to this information where people otherwise may not have, providing information to, more justice, it makes that sense there as well.
Totally. I'm all about that. I think as lawyers, we have an obligation to make access to justice more available, to give the information, to put the power of the law back into the client's hands, and to take it away from the lawyers. An example of this that I've seen work really well is with a firm that I used to work at, Legal Vision. They most of their marketing strategy was built around content marketing. And each month, every lawyer in the firm would take a day off to write 3,000 words that would be published on the firm's website. And those 3,000 words, some of them were substantial legal articles about key issues in the industry or for their clients. And others were just answering basic legal questions, like what are some of the key things that I need to have in an employment agreement? Or how do I find my company number online? And by doing that, they were not just providing value to clients and getting them to trust the brands, they were also enhancing access to justice because clients were able to self-serve and answer questions that they needed answered. And that's a great thing that moves the whole profession forward.
Right. And also just a bit of a selfish thing like we talked about before. Doing a podcast or doing this sort of stuff really forces you to learn, right? Because you may be talking about something and you know about it, but you only know something if you can teach it to someone, right? So to be able to talk cogently about something really forces you to build your skill set.
Yeah, 100%. And I found that when I had to write articles about things, about legal areas, I really developed my skill set. And I think with podcasting, that can be, something that you give the opportunity of the lawyers in your firm to learn something and then present about, which is great for their careers, but also great for the firm too, because you then have the opportunity of institutionalizing that knowledge. And so, an example back to Legal Vision, they now have these 4,000 helpful articles. And those articles then become a valuable asset that the firm can use. I don't know, I don't work for them anymore. I don't know what they're doing with it, but you can imagine once you have all that data and information, that's something that you can then sell as a product or a service, and that creates another revenue stream for your firm. Very similarly, I can't see why podcasts wouldn't turn into continuing legal education that you could sell to other firms, or even, yeah, you go.
Yeah, and no, I'm just thinking about myself. I'm not going to sit down and read like a 4-page article about something. I'm just going to go on my commute and going to pop in my headphones and listen. So it's really good to sort of build, this medium is great for us millennials, right? Whose attention span is quite short. So it really lends itself to that. And you can easily convert one of those articles into a podcast episode, right? Yeah. Okay, so let's assume that everyone's watching this sees the light and understands the value of podcasting, but to do it is a bit different, right? It's easy to say, oh, we're going to start a podcast, we're going to talk about this and this, and these are the advantages. But can you walk us through sort of how does this actually work? How do you produce a podcast sort of like from start to finish?
Yeah, there's a bit of a brainstorming process that happens first, which is once you're on board with everything we've just talked about, you really do have to have a core purpose for your podcasts and a core audience that you have in mind. And so if I use my own example, my purpose was to, as I said earlier, interview great lawyers so that I can learn what it takes to be successful and then share those lessons on to other people. And my imagined audience were people like me. So they might be young lawyers or law students who are thinking about how to have great careers, or they might be later career lawyers who are thinking about changing career and want to know what it takes to get to the next level or to move laterally, right? So I have a really core audience in mind. When I'm recording my podcasts and picking the guests that I want to speak to, I speak to those. I imagine that I'm speaking to that audience.
Right. So if you're like a full service law firm, you shouldn't really be just throwing out episodes about real estate and about this and about that and about that, right? Or should you
Yeah,
really
well, you might
focus?
want to be right. So your purpose for the podcast might be client centric, or it might be profession centric. Is your goal to elevate your status within the profession so that lawyers refer more work to you and you can attract great talent, or is your goal to attract more clients? They would
Mm,
be two very different podcasts, right? So if
right.
your goal is to attract more clients, you're probably not necessarily going to interview lawyers, and you're probably not going to talk about issues in the legal profession. You're going to talk about things that are relevant to your clients. And a good example of this might be startup law. I could imagine a startup lawyer talking about issues in startup land. They could talk about capital raising. They could talk about growth. They could have marketing experts on that actually add value to their audience, but they wouldn't talk a lot about the nuances of a partnership agreement, right? Or
Right.
the nuances of your terms and conditions, because startups would tune out.
So, all right. So you've identified your target. You've come up with the audience. You know the name of your podcast. You've come up with the podcast cover title. Everything's set up in your mind. What's the next step? How do we host these things? I mean, or how's that work?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I'd recommend doing a trial run, and getting everything ready for that trial run. The way I started my podcast was actually by landing a relatively big guest first off, and then realizing that I would need to prepare for it. And I would have recommend doing that because it was quite a stressful experience. But it meant that I went through the process really quickly. I bought a relatively cheap microphone. I got my setup right, so I figured out what hardware I needed, and I also figured out what software I would need to record and edit the podcast, and then I figured out what applications I would need to beam the podcast out to everybody and market it. So I think there's probably those three key categories: what hardware, what software, and what platforms to market and distribute.
All right. So just breaking that down a bit. So the equipment, I mean, and people can Google this, so you can find out all the information. I mean, come on, it's 2020. But you need a microphone. You need something to record, right? So most often you're going to have a laptop, and you're probably going to use Zoom, right, to connect or some similar um, system. All right. So you have your audio file, right? What do you do with that next?
Yeah, so once you've got the audio file, assuming you've managed to record your interview over Zoom and you've got a microphone set up, I usually record it over Zoom, which is then saved, as you said, into an audio file, and I'll edit that file in GarageBand, which is an app that comes native on my Mac software. But Audacity is a free app that I know a lot of podcasters use, and it's really easy to use. And I'm no technical expert, and I find GarageBand really, really easy to use for editing.
So for all the non-technical guys out here, when you say editing, what does that mean? What are you editing? What are you doing? What are you looking out for? What are you fixing or solving?
Yeah, good question. So I run a podcast that's a interview format. So that means there's a minimal amount of editing that I need to do. I'm simply editing any glitches in the recording, any breaks or silences in the interview that I've done, and also recording an introduction over the top so that there is some sort of intro to the show. So that's what editing means for me. However, I know that there are more complex forms that you can run a podcast. Like I'm sure many people listen to NPR or BBC, where they're story-driven podcasts, and that would require quite a bit more editing. And if that's the medium that you choose for your podcasting, I say good luck to you, and I'm not the expert.
Yeah, I mean, just doing the BD roundtable, I can tell you, there's a lot that can go in to this. Imagine throwing a video into that.
Right.
And people spend hours and hours and hours on editing out all of the ums, getting all of the EQ balancings right. It can be a nightmare, but you don't need to get to that level of sophistication, do you? I mean, as long as it sounds decent. it doesn't really, you don't need to get that level.
Hmm. I think it's got to fit with your purpose. I imagine, lawyers are great perfectionists, and I think that's actually a good thing if you can bring that into podcasting. But I do also think, for my purposes, authenticity is a really important part of my podcast, and I want people to feel connected to the people that I interview and to me as the host. And by over editing and over engineering the podcast, I feel that it puts a bit of a barrier between me and my audience. And similarly for law firms, if your goal is to get people to understand your brand and really interact with it and feel connected to it, over engineering your podcast and making it feel inaccessible is probably not the best thing to do.
Yeah, and I think most of the time the BD teams are going to be the one editing this, and we don't have time for that, right? So
Yeah,
now you
we're
can always
busy.
outsource, right? You can always there are software and people and who can do that for you if that's an option on the budget wise. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that's definitely possible. I mean, I broke down the time that it takes me to edit each podcast. I think it takes about an hour to an hour and a half to edit and record the introduction over the top. And then it takes you about an hour to an hour and a half to record the podcast, the actual interview, you're looking at 2 to 3 hours a week just to get the audio file correct before you even market it and upload. So if that doesn't fit within your time frame or your schedule, then definitely outsourcing it can be a great thing to do.
that's right. That's right. Okay, so you've got the file, you've got it all good and polished, and it sounds perfect. Where do we put it? I mean, how do you host something? How do you get it on iTunes? How do you get it on Spotify and
Yeah,
Overcast and all these? How's that work?
it seems overwhelming, and I'm really glad that I started a podcast in 2020. In fact, I actually started a podcast 5 years ago in a different industry, and it was much harder to get it out into the world than it is today. There are great websites like Podbean and Buzzsprout, where you can upload your audio file. And using that platform, it will actually distribute your audio file to all the other major podcasting platforms, including iTunes and Spotify, Stitcher, and all the others. And so I found that to be immensely helpful. I spend no time uploading to every platform. Instead, I just upload to one website, Buzzsprout.
Right. So that's a hosting site. You upload the file. I think there's like a $15 fee,
Correct.
right, per month to host it there. And that gives you sort of the landing page, right, where you can put all your artwork and you put all the show notes in there. And then that will distribute it. And you pay those sites to do it for you. I was also looking into this for the BD Roundtable, and I installed a plugin, and Paul knows how much I hate plugins for WordPress, but there's a few nice podcasting plugins. So I did that. I uploaded the file, so it's hosted on my website, and then I just subscribed that RSS feed into iTunes and Spotify, and it seemed to work. It was kind of like magic. You didn't really have to do much, and then I
Yep.
just upload it there, and it's good to go. Yeah, so there's really not much of a barrier nowadays to getting it out
Yeah, my encouragement would be to not worry too much. If you've got a great audio file, the
there.
next steps are actually not that difficult.
Okay.
Once if you're like me, I'm kind of hands-on person. It's hard to hear about it, but once you go to these websites like Buzzsprout and Podbean, you'll find it's really easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've gone through all the effort to get that file, I think you can distribute it. Yeah. And so you said 1 hour of podcast will average what, like 3 to 5 hours in total, and that's including prep time and everything.
Yeah,
So
that's what it
definitely,
takes for me. And I also include in that time posting it to social media, replying to the comments and the questions that I get about the interviews that I do. But I probably don't include in that the time it takes to have a 15-minute call with my guest before the podcast, or actually reach out to guests and bring them on, or respond to the messages that listeners send to me. So although it probably takes me 3.5 to 5 hours per episode, there are bits and pieces outside of that are involved with running a podcast that fluctuate week in, week out.
And you're doing this every week?
Yes, and for a period I was actually uploading twice per week, but that was untenable. But I guess once it becomes part of my schedule, it's much easier, and the reward is so great. There's two rewards. Firstly, meeting and connecting with really great people that inspire me to do things. I often finish a podcast and want to go and do something with the information that I've been given. And secondly, getting the feedback. I've genuinely received more messages than I can count via email and LinkedIn from people who really enjoy the show, law students, career lawyers who are thinking deeply about what they want to do with themselves, and the podcast actually helps. And so that impact makes it really worth it.
Yeah, and it can be really rewarding, and it's sort of a cycle where, for me at least, some days I'm like, oh, right, should I just pull the plug? And then that day I'll get a message on LinkedIn, it's like, oh, thank you so much. This is, I've always wanted to join a community like this. And they're like, oh, okay, batteries recharged.
Yeah,
let's go ahead and do it.
It's a cycle for sure.
All right. Now, as we wrap up, I have a whole bunch of questions which we'll save for the Q&A session. But for those firms who are still on the, teetering as shouldn't we, what advice would you give them?
Look, I think my big piece of advice is that the legal industry and law firms are often slow to pick up on trends that other industries take advantage of very quickly and profit from and have great impact on their business. And so if you can look at other industries, comparable industries, and see that there are podcasts in that industry that are successful, which I believe there are, then I think that should be enough motivation for you to say there is an opportunity here to take advantage of what is essentially a greenfields market and put out some really great content. And the opportunity is there, and then there's a really strong reason to do that, which is not just attracting better clients and more clients. There's definitely that opportunity, but it's also contributing to the profession by providing more great content for lawyers to interact with. And building that community too. So I think there's a great opportunity and there's a great reason to do it.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And everyone who's watching this, head on over to the Leading Lawyer podcast, or we will put links in the description so you can find that easily. So again, thank you so much.
No, thanks for having me, Will. Appreciate it.